1939, Britain moved almost everything by rail, while its roads were scattered with a patchwork of old trucks. Then war erupted, and overnight the entire British war machine faced a staggering logistics crisis. Tens of thousands of lorries were needed, and fast. Nearly 530,000 trucks would be built, but it was not firepower that would decide Britain's fate. It was whether these lorries could keep the nation moving. How did an underprepared transport system transform into the backbone of Allied victory, and why do we rarely hear the true story behind the British lorries of World War II? Britain's transport backbone in the late 1930s rested firmly on steel rails. Railways hauled nearly 3/4 of all inland freight, ton-miles, carrying coal, manufactured goods and raw materials from ports to factories and cities. Even as road traffic grew, lorries accounted for barely 1 in 10 ton-miles moved across the country. The roads themselves were narrow, often poorly surfaced and riddled with bottlenecks. Freight by road was limited to short hauls, urgent deliveries, or routes the railways could not reach. The commercial lorry fleet was a patchwork of makes and models. Around 200,000 trucks plied British roads before the war, most built for peacetime needs. There was no single standard. Some vehicles dated back to the 1920s, others were new, and capacities ranged from small vans to heavy haulers. Each company, Bedford, Leyland, Albion, Guy and Scammell, supplied its own designs with unique engines, gearboxes and spare parts. Haulage firms operated with whatever they could afford or find, swapping and repairing as needed, but rarely with any thought to uniformity. This diversity bred headaches. Mechanics faced a jumble of unfamiliar parts, drivers needed to know multiple gear patterns, and breakdowns meant scouring the country for the right replacement. Training was slow, repairs unpredictable, and spare parts supply a constant challenge. The lack of standardization was felt most sharply by small hauliers who struggled to keep old lorries running on tight margins. Britain's reliance on rail and its fragmented lorry fleet left the country vulnerable. The system worked in peacetime, but it offered little flexibility for sudden, large-scale demands. When war erupted, the need for rapid mobilization, mass evacuation and military supply convoys exposed these weaknesses at once. The nation's logistics network was about to face a test it had never prepared for. September 1939 brought a scale of disruption Britain's roads had never seen. Within days of the declaration of war, the government ordered the evacuation of more than 1.5 million civilians from London and other cities. Convoys of every available bus, coach and lorry streamed through the countryside, moving children and mothers to safety. Railways handled much of the distance, but tens of thousands of road vehicles were pressed into service. Roads jammed with trucks, some loaded with household goods, others packed with factory machinery as industrial plants hurried to relocate away from likely bombing targets. By October 1939, over 500,000 tons of equipment had been shifted from vulnerable cities to safer sites, a logistical feat that depended on lorries as much as locomotives. The military's needs multiplied even faster. The British Expeditionary Force required a motorised supply line on a scale never attempted before. In just the first week of mobilisation, the War Office requisitioned 12,000 civilian lorries for immediate military use. By the end of October 1939, more than 75,000 trucks had been impressed into service, drawn from haulage firms, local councils and small businesses. Many of these vehicles were old, built for peacetime loads and ill-suited to the hard use of war. Still, they rolled out in convoys, carrying ammunition, fuel and rations to ports and depots, their drivers often learning new routes and regulations overnight. The sudden surge exposed the limits of Britain's piecemeal truck fleet. Mechanics struggled to keep unfamiliar vehicles running, spare parts ran short and breakdowns multiplied on the crowded roads. As lorries wore out or were lost in France, the gap between need and supply widened sharply. The government responded with emergency orders for new trucks from every major manufacturer, setting the stage for a transformation in how Britain built, supplied and maintained its wartime lorry fleet. By the autumn of 1940, the Ministry of Supply faced a hard economic reality. Britain's lorry factories were stretched to their limits, yet the demands of war kept rising. Officials pored over production budgets and delivery ledgers, searching for any margin that could be turned into more trucks on the road. One calculation stood out. It cost nearly the same in materials, labour and machine time to build a 3-ton lorry as it did to produce the smaller 1.5-ton models. But the larger truck could haul lorry as it did to produce the smaller 1.5-ton models. But the larger truck could haul twice the load. Every pound spent on a 3-tonner delivered double the carrying power for the same investment. This logic drove a decisive policy. The ministry directed manufacturers to focus on the 3-ton class, scaling back smaller models to a minimum. Factories retooled their lines to churn out a standard truck, streamlining assembly and cutting unnecessary variations. Simplified specifications meant fewer unique parts, easier training for new drivers, and a repair system that could function even under the chaos of wartime supply. Mechanics could swap components between vehicles with confidence, knowing a wheel or gearbox from one lorry would fit another. For the ministry, every hour of saved repair time and every ton of cargo moved counted against the relentless pressure of the war economy. The benefits reached beyond the workshop. By concentrating on a single standardized type, the ministry could order parts and materials in bulk, negotiate better prices, and keep production lines running at full tilt. This policy shift gave British industry a clear target: build as many reliable, interchangeable 3-ton lorries as possible and get them to the front lines faster. The decision set the framework for the engineering work that followed, laying the foundation for a standard parts philosophy that would underpin Britain's wartime logistics. A pilot model of the Bedford QL rolled out of the Luton Works in February 1940, just months after the War Office called for a new 3-ton 4x4 truck. Production began in earnest by March 1941, as Bedford's engineers and assembly crews worked around the clock to turn prototypes into thousands of vehicles ready for the front. The QL's forward control layout set it apart, placing the cab above the engine to shorten the wheelbase, improve manoeuvrability, and give drivers a clearer view of crowded roads and convoy routes. The heart of the QL was its modular chassis. This backbone allowed the same frame to serve as a troop carrier, a signals van, an ambulance, or a workshop truck. Factory diagrams from the time show how standard jacking points, bolt patterns, and axle assemblies could be swapped between variants, keeping repairs simple and production lines moving. One assembler later recalled the steady rhythm of wartime shifts. They said they would see bare chassis roll in at one end of the line, and by the end of the shift the vehicle could be a troop carrier or a wireless truck, depending on what the army needed that week. More than 3,300 QLT troop carriers alone left the plant from August 1941 onwards, each designed to move 29 soldiers and their kit. The pressure was relentless, but the sense of purpose was clear. Engineers concentrated on ruggedness and common sense, using standard fasteners, accessible engine bays and robust leaf springs because they knew these trucks would face rough roads and require battlefield repairs far from any depot. The modular QL design meant that if a truck broke down in France, North Africa or Italy, a mechanic could use parts from another QL to get it running again. This approach, born on the factory floor, would soon prove its worth on the battlefields of Europe and beyond. The result was greater reliability in the field and faster turnaround for damaged vehicles. Leyland engineers faced a different challenge from their Bedford counterparts. Where the majority of wartime lorries focused on the 3-ton class, Leyland expertise lay in heavy tractors and high-capacity hauliers. The Leyland Hippo was, for example, a 10-ton 6x4 truck introduced in 1944, designed for moving vast amounts of supplies or towing heavy artillery. Its well-typed loading floor and robust leaf spring suspension allowed easier loading of bulky equipment, while its low-revving diesel engine provided the torque needed for slow, steady pulls over rough ground. Heavy tractor contracts from the Ministry of Supply specified reinforced frames, powerful winches and double reduction rear axles, features essential for tank transporters and recovery work. Guy Motors, meanwhile, carved out a reputation for artillery tractors. Their design teams focused on traction and gearing, producing vehicles capable of hauling field guns and anti-aircraft pieces across muddy fields or up steep inclines. The Guy Quadrant was one such specialist, equipped with 4-wheel drive and a low-range gearbox, ensuring that gunners could position their weapons even in the most difficult terrain. These vehicles shared as many components as possible with the standard fleet, following the ministry doctrine of interchangeable parts. Brake drums, wheel hubs, and even dashboard instruments were drawn from the same bins used by lighter lorries, easing the strain on supply depots and workshops. Despite their size and complexity, heavy and specialist lorries fit within the broader pattern of wartime standardization. Leyland and Guy worked to the same principles as Bedford: simplify wherever possible, share parts across models, and design for maintenance by mechanics with only basic training. The result was a fleet where even the largest vehicles could be kept running with the same spares, and know-how that sustained the army workhorses. This approach proved vital as the front lines stretched, and the demands on recovery and artillery support only grew. Night after night, blackout regulations turned British roads into narrow ribbons of darkness. Lorries fitted with slit-masked headlamps crept through bomb-damaged streets, their drivers straining to see just a few yards ahead. Air raid precautions crews relied on Albion trucks to haul rubble, clear fires, and ferry rescue teams to collapsed buildings. An air raid precautions driver recalled the constant jolt of brakes and the sting of smoke as they worked through the night, shoveling debris by torchlight. The blackout made every delivery a test of nerve and memory, with only faint glimmers from the mast lights to guide the way. Across the Mediterranean, British lorries faced a different kind of trial. In North Africa, desert convoys battled heat, dust, and mechanical strain. Drivers learned to clean air filters 3 times a day using strips of cloth to keep sand from choking engines. Radiator hoses patched with canvas and wire were the difference between reaching the next water point or boiling over under a relentless sun. An Army Service Corps corporal remembered how every stop meant checking for leaks, tightening bolts, and shaking sand from the fuel lines. The reliability of these trucks, Bedfords, Albions, Leylands, became a matter of survival, not just efficiency. In Italy, recovery crews depended on Scammell pioneers to winch tanks from mud and shell craters. A sergeant described rigging a tow bar from spare axles as shells landed nearby, trusting in the Scammel's low gearing and heavy winch to drag a bogged Churchill back to the road. Whether clearing London streets or hauling supplies up the spine of Italy, these lorries proved their worth under every kind of pressure. Their simple, rugged designs, standardised parts, accessible engines, and sturdy frames meant that repairs could be made with whatever was at hand. Field improvisation and the steady hands of drivers and mechanics kept Britain's supply lines moving from blackout cities to desert tracks and mountain passes. American trucks began arriving in Britain under the Lend-Lease programme long before the Normandy landings. Shipments included thousands of GMCCCKW Deuce and a half, 2.5-ton 6x6 trucks and Studebaker US-6 models, each built to American military standards. By 1945, more than 100,000 GMCCCKW vehicles had crossed the Atlantic, and Studebaker's distinctive rounded cab design had become a familiar sight in British and Commonwealth convoys. These vehicles brought new features including full-time 6-wheel drive, robust suspension for rough terrain, and a standardised approach to mass production that sometimes contrasted sharply with British methods. Integrating American trucks into British service was not always seamless. The GMC-CCKW, for example, used left-hand drive, unfamiliar controls and electrical systems based on American specifications. British mechanics faced a new learning curve, needing different spares and tools for repairs. Yet the trucks offered undeniable advantages in payload, off-road ability and sheer numbers. Convoy planners could now count on a steady flow of American-built vehicles to fill gaps left by losses in North Africa, Italy and Northwest Europe. Despite the influx, British lorries remained the backbone of supply. The Ministry of Supply kept domestic production running at full tilt, focusing on the standardised 3-ton class, even as Lend-Lease vehicles supplemented the fleet. The coexistence of British and American trucks created a mixed but resilient force, able to adapt to the shifting demands of global war. The scale of Lend-Lease support eased some resource pressures, but it also introduced new strains, different maintenance regimes, spare parts inventories, and training requirements. In the end, the Allied supply chain became a patchwork of designs, each playing a part in the wider logistics effort. By late 1944, the British lorry fleet was running hard against the limits of wartime supply. Fuel rationing, which had begun as a temporary measure in 1939, now defined every mile a truck could travel. Civilian hauliers and military convoys alike queued for their allocations, and the Ministry of War Transport issued strict directives on permitted journeys and on load priorities. Tyre shortages became a daily obstacle after the loss of Far Eastern rubber supplies. Retreaded tyres and carefully rationed spares kept trucks rolling, but breakdowns from worn treads and split casings increased. To stretch dwindling petrol stocks, thousands of lorries were converted to run on producer gas units, bulky gasifiers mounted behind the cab, burning coal or coke to generate fuel. These conversions sapped engine power and required constant tending, but they offered a lifeline for essential services when liquid fuel was scarce. As the war in Europe drew to a close, the sheer volume of vehicles produced left Britain with an enormous surplus. The Ministry of War Transport established the Surplus Vehicle Disposal Board to manage the transition from military to civilian use. The first public auction of ex-army lorries took place in May 1946, with hundreds of Bedford QLs, Leylands and Albions lined up for new owners. Haulage firms, farmers and small businesses flocked to these sales, eager to snap up reliable trucks at government-set prices. Auction records show that within 2 years, tens of thousands of surplus vehicles had entered civilian fleets, powering the reconstruction of roads, factories and farms across Britain. The lorries that had carried men and munitions through war now hauled bricks, timber and machinery, bridging the divide between wartime necessity and peacetime recovery. Today, global supply chains rely on trucks more than ever, yet the quiet lesson from wartime Britain endures.